Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first in a series of webinars this spring from Old Fort Niagara. Well, for most students of the French and Indian War, Daniel-Hyacinthe-Marie Lienard de Beaujeu is seen as a shooting star on the stage of history. We know about his dramatic death at the Battle of the Monongahela, and tonight I hope we'll learn a little bit more about his life. So most accounts of Braddock's campaign against Fort Duquesne talk about how the British Army struggles over the Allegheny Mountains, Braddock's road building, his relations with native people. He crosses the Monongahela River to the North Shore, and suddenly, from out of the woods comes a force of French and native warriors led by a bare-chested Beaujeu. Beaujeu is killed on the third British volley, and Braddock's disaster proceeds. In this image, for example, Beaujeu is shown wearing a fringed hunting shirt, probably buckskin. So this is a 19th century view, but it does depict him very early on. So Beaujeu's heroism has been immortalized in literature, in artwork, and even military miniatures depict his appearance at the Battle of the Monongahela. But let's look at his life. Let's examine. There's fragmentary evidence that he sort of darts in and out of history. So let's look at what we know at this point. He's born in Montreal on August 9th, 1711. Now, ironically, he was just to the day, he was a month short of his 44th birthday when he was killed in action at the Monongahela. In the 18th century, family connections are very, very important. And Beaujeu had very strong and very powerful family connections. The family traces its roots back to the 11th century, and there were even Beaujeux who participated in the Crusades. But more immediately, Daniel's father was Louis Lienard de Beaujeu. He was born in 1683 in Paris. And in 1691, this is obviously a sinecure, but he succeeded his father as officer in charge of the king's pantry, the king being Louis XIV at that time. In 1697, Louis sails to New France, ostensibly to seek his fortune, although he's pretty young at this point. And he secures a commission in the Compagnie Franche de la Marine. He still retains his court connections, but he becomes an ensign in 1702, a lieutenant in 1704, a captain in 1711, and in 1712, he is named to very important job in carrying official dispatches to France. The Governor General, Philippe Rigaud de Vaudreuil, said of him, he is exact in carrying out orders, he's attached to the service, and very zealous to maintain good order. Well, ultimately, he's assigned to the upper country, and he commands Michilimackinac from 1719 to 1722. Receives the Croix de Saint Louis in 1726 on the much coveted decoration. And then he is second in command of an expedition against the Fox Nation in 1728. He then continues, and this campaign took place in the modern states of Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. He is then elevated to garrison adjutant of New France, a member of the Council of War. He acquires a seigneury on the Richelieu River, and he retires from military service in 1748. So Daniel's father has a long and illustrious military career. But that's not all that we are going to talk about tonight. We're also going to talk a little bit about his personal life, from Mars to Cupid. He is accused of rape in 1705. There's an account from Montreal. Marie Le Soeur worked at the home of Laurent Renaud for the amount of 4 livres per month and left it because the Sieur de Beaujeu, a lieutenant in the Troupe de la Marine, who was living in the home of the said Renaud, constantly asked her to go to bed with him, going to find her everywhere her housework took her, whether in the garret or the cellar or in the upstairs rooms, and especially during the night when she was asleep, because she slept in a single room where she did the cooking for the household. She declares that one night the said Beaujeu, among other nights during the first 2 weeks or so of the said month of last November, had come to find her as she was sleeping, wanting to possess her carnally. She awakened and tried to prevent him from doing it by crying out. He threatened to put his sword through her body if she cried out, which he did 3 separate times, and he had her carnally on 3 different nights. Whatever became of this case, I do not know, but the following year, Louis marries Therese Denise Millon de Bresson. Her parents are, again, very wealthy and well-connected people. She is a wealthy widow, and before too long, in 1711, she gives birth to Daniel. He's the second son of this marriage. Now, interestingly enough, and this comes to play later on in Beaujeu's career, especially here at Niagara, his sister Charlotte marries Jean-Victor Verin de la Mer, the commissary and controller of the Marine, subdelegate of the Intendant, and counselor of the Conseil Supérieur of Quebec. So this is a very, very important man in the administration of New France, and he is Danielle's brother-in-law. Her dowry is 6,000 livres, which is very handsome. Now, historians believe that Daniel served as a cadet in the upper country as a young man, possibly with his father. And at this point, this is what historians believe, although his early career is poorly documented, but they believe that he learned native languages and native culture at this time, which he later displays in his various diplomatic and military escapades. Well, he gets married in 1737. He marries a woman named Michelle Elizabeth Foucault. He's 25, she's 18. And again, a very important family connection. She is the daughter of François Foucault. He's a seigneur, a merchant, a member of the Conseil Supérieur. So he marries well into a very important man. Unfortunately, in his later career, Francois kind of runs afoul of the royal authority. It seems that he mixed royal funds with those of his own business enterprises, which got him into trouble. But nonetheless, Beaujeu married well into this family. One might ask what he did from 1737 to 1746. And we don't know a lot about that time period, but we do know one thing that he was up to. He and his wife produce a child every year from 1738 to 1745. And unfortunately, most of these children die in infancy. We don't know if they're born deceased or if they die at a very young age, but the infant mortality rate was very high. It was high in New France, but this was way higher than the norm, even at that time. Historians believe that only 2 of these children survived into adulthood. So this has to have taken a toll on his mind, with all of his children not even living a year. Well, King George's War breaks out in 1744. This is an extension of the War of Austrian Succession, which of course began in Europe. And it's time for Daniel to take the field in this conflict. In 1745, Louisbourg, the great French fortress that guards the entrance to the St. Lawrence, falls to New England troops and supported by the Royal Navy. The following year, France dispatches a massive fleet under the Duc d'Anville to retake Louisbourg, to win back Acadia, and ravage the New England coast, perhaps even as far south as Boston. This armada carries 11,000 men and is made up of 64 ships. Historians believe that this is the largest expeditionary force to North America before the American Revolution. And we also see an image here of the Duc d'Anville. They have a lot of problems in their voyage to North America, a lot of problems. First of all, they get hit by a storm when they're not even out of the Bay of Biscay. Then typhus and scurvy break out aboard the fleet, and it literally wipes out hundreds of sailors and soldiers. They get to the Azores and they're becalmed for weeks. They hit more storms. Ships are struck by lightning. One of the magazines explodes. In the end, about 3,000 are dead or seriously ill from this expedition. Now, normally, it takes about 7 weeks from France to Nova Scotia, and this fleet took 3 months. They did not arrive till September, so it was a really disastrous expedition in terms of and not due to combat. It was weather and illness that did this fleet in. Now, to support d'Anville's expedition, Lieutenant Beaujeu is posted to a 700-man army that's going to go from Quebec to Nova Scotia, and they're going to sail there. And I don't think that Beaujeu was much of a sea dog. I think he was pretty much a landlubber. He writes in his journal while they're in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, he writes, "Every night we had 2 feet of water on deck, all on fire. I began to conceive a great disgust for the mariner's life, as did almost all our milice, especially when being obliged to go aloft." And then later he says, and this is very interesting, it's kind of like when you're sitting on an airplane and you're watching the mechanic underneath the fuselage, scratching his head and shaking his head and kind of looking doubtful. It kind of erodes your confidence. Well, he said, "I heard the sailors devoutly sing the Lord's praises, which did not seem usual among these sorts of people when they are not in danger." So Beaujeu is not enjoying the life of a mariner as he sails from Quebec to Nova Scotia. So this 700-man expedition is under the command of Jean-Baptiste Nicolas Roche de Ramezay. And they're going to sail this way, and they're going to end up in a place called Beaubassin, and they're going to set up camp there. So they're waiting for d'Anville's fleet, and Beaujeu is one of the officers who is assigned to requisition provisions from civilians. Now, the Acadians are not particularly wealthy people, and Beaujeu wrote in his journal that he felt shame for playing the thief as he confiscated cattle and sheep from angry women. This gives us a little bit of insight into his personality, I believe. Well, then in September, the fleet from France has finally arrived. They arrive at a place called Chebucto, which is now Halifax. Halifax has not yet been established. And Beaujeu is selected to carry dispatches from Ramezay at Beaubassin to the fleet at Chebucto. So he goes across land spends several days in the wild, and he arrives at the end of September at the fleet carrying important dispatches, and he learns that D'Anville, the admiral commanding the fleet, has had a stroke and died. He reports to the second in command of the fleet, and the second in command of the fleet also, he's completely demoralized. He attempts suicide and then later resigns. So the command of the fleet falls to this guy, Jacques-Pierre de Taffanel de la Jonquière. He has been appointed the new governor of New France, and he's a passenger on these vessels. So Beaujeu goes and pays his respects to Jonquière. Jonquière offers him a meal and a bed for the night. And then Beaujeu turns around and heads back to Beaubassin. Again, I think this sort of speaks to the status that Beaujeu enjoyed. Well, in October, the British have a base at Annapolis Royal here, around here, and Ramezay decides he's going to besiege it. The fleet is supposed to come around and support him, but the fleet's had enough. And Jonquière decides to sail back to France. Ramezay has to lift the siege and retire back to Beaubassin. Well, Governor Shirley of Massachusetts responds to this threat, and he sends additional troops to Nova Scotia. And these troops, some of these troops advance to a place called Grand Pre, which is northeast of Annapolis Royal on the Minas Basin. And this is sort of like an advanced staging post for what they hope will be an attack on Beaubassin come spring. Well, the French cannot tolerate this advanced post. And so in January, in the dead of winter, they decide to attack this post. And they're going to do it when the British least expect it. Once again, the British are lulled by the winter weather into thinking that they are not going to be attacked. This happened over and over again. I don't know why they believed this, but it was, they had spread their troops out among 24 civilian houses in this sort of spread out village of Grand Pre. So the forces aren't even concentrated. So they begin their march, 300 soldiers and milice led by Captain Nicolas Antoine Coulon de Villiers. They begin a 3-week-long trek to Grand Pre. They're going to head from Beaubassin. They're going to head east where they can pick up supplies. And then south, they have to skirt the Minas Basin, come around, and they're going to attack Grand Pre. They reach there by February 11th. 1747. They're joined by native warriors on the way. So their force is probably closer to 500 men when they finally arrive at Grand Pre. So as I said, this journey is on snowshoes. They're dragging their equipment behind them on sleds. Temperatures at night are going down to 10 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. So this is a very, very difficult march. They're digging holes in the snow to get out of the wind at night. But this is how they make their way secretly to Grand Pre. At 3 a.m. on February 11th, they attack in a blinding snowstorm. What they've done is they have very good intelligence that the British garrison is spread out all over this village. So what they decide to do is they divide their attacking force into small parties, each under the command of a lead officer, and they're going to simultaneously hit the most important of these houses at the same time. Now, Beaujeu is part of the commander's squad, de Villiers. And by the way, let me insert here, Francis Parkman got this wrong. He thought that this was Louis Coulon de Villiers, who later on defeated Washington at Fort Necessity, but that was incorrect. This was Nicolas, and Nicolas was a brother of Louis, so it's not the same guy. But anyway, Beaujeu writes in his journal as they're attacking at 3 o'clock in the morning, a sentry who spotted us cried, "Who goes there?" But the night was so dark, and we were hugging the ground so closely with our bellies, silent as thieves, that although we were within 30 paces, the enemy considered it to have been a false alarm and went back inside again. The sentry cried, "To arms," and the whole guard gave us a volley. I was intent on silencing that sentry, and indeed he was the first man I killed. In less than 10 minutes, we took the guardhouse. All our people did marvels there. 21 corpses and three prisoners were proof of the detachment's courage. And this is even more interesting because Villiers, early on in this attack, sustains a very serious wound. So it falls to Beaujeu, Lieutenant Beaujeu, to take command of this particular party and lead them in battle. Noble, the commander of the Massachusetts troops, and he's actually from Maine, he is killed in the action. And here's a monument to him that's in his town of Noblesboro, Maine. He actually was involved in the siege of Louisburg the year, 2 years before, but he was killed during this surprise attack in February of 1747. Well, the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle ends King George's War, and shortly after that, Beaujeu is promoted captain. We know that he attended a native council at the Chateau Saint-Louis in Quebec. He signed as a witness. This was a very important council because the French were trying to negate British claims that the Six Nations were their subjects. And they did achieve this. The delegates present from the Haudenosaunee people declared that they were not subjects of King George. And this was very important because the French are already looking to the Ohio Valley. And this is an important diplomatic step in allowing them to extend their influence into that region. But here we have Beaujeu's signature as a witness to these proceedings. His next step, he becomes Commandant of Fort Niagara. He arrives here on July the 5th, 1749. It's a very auspicious time at Fort Niagara, and we'll get into that in just a moment. He's going to relieve Captain de Raymond, and some of you may be familiar with Captain de Raymond. He was the author of the Dénombrement de tout poste du Canada. In other words, a scathing critique of French posts in the upper country. Raymond had advice for how a number of posts in the upper country could be better managed. And he was probably right, but let's look at how he did when he was commander of Fort Niagara. Beaujeu relieves him in July of 1749. This is probably what the fort looked like. It's unclear when some of these buildings were actually built. We know they were here by 1755. We do know, of course, that the French castle was in place and the bakehouse and possibly some of these other buildings. But the important point here is that we have got a wooden stockade, a four-bastion wooden stockade that surrounds this little fort. It's not the fort we see today. And this was described by a number of people as little better than a cattle pen, that it could barely stand on its own. So Beaujeu is going to be finding Fort Niagara in very, very sad shape. He was a voluminous letter writer, and he communicated with the governor of New France quite frequently. And we were fortunate enough to get some of these letters translated a few years back. And here are some of the comments that he had about Fort Niagara when he first arrived here in July of 1749. He said, "I never expected to find this settlement so badly maintained. Munitions were going bad from lack of housing. There were no more than 50 cords of wood cut of the 1,200 needed. He said we were obliged to store hay outside and it's going bad. The garrison are veteran drunkards from Montreal. He wanted to send them all back. Something that we still deal with today. He said this fort will never be solid and will always be in danger of falling into the lake." He advocated moving Fort Niagara to the opposite shore, where the north shore of Niagara on the lake is today. He didn't think much of the skills among his garrison. He said, "I don't have a man capable of making a peg." And he also said that he would be satisfied if he could find one of his soldiers who could wield an axe. So interesting comments. I think Beaujeu was genuinely appalled at the conditions he found when he arrived here at Fort Niagara. And he also said the arsenal is full of cheap, unreliable trade guns. And this seems to have been a continual problem at Fort Niagara, even up until the siege of 1759. They're complaining about the quality of weapons in the arsenal. He's forced to destroy bunks due to an infestation of bed bugs. Now, this is something that, Raymond is not guilty for, but one of the things that Beaujeu minded was the officers' rooms overlook the lake, and officers can't see what the men are doing on the parade ground. And I think this speaks to Beaujeu's personality. He was a hardcore, serious military officer, took his duty very seriously. He arrived at Fort Niagara. He had to hit the ground running because this was the same time that the Céloron expedition was crossing the Niagara portage. Couple hundred men and all their supplies. Céloron is going to move down into the Ohio Valley and plant these lead plates, reclaiming the land for France. But Beaujeu has to help. As soon as he arrives, he has to help get all of these men and their supplies and their boats around Niagara Falls. They're going to have to go from the lower landing here where Lewiston, New York stands today, up over this 180-foot or so high escarpment to the flat land at the top, and then on up to the upper landing. It's a big undertaking, moving all this stuff from the lower landing to the upper landing. And so he's got to do it as soon as he arrives. Perhaps his biggest job here was native diplomacy. And I think there's one incident that occurred shortly after he arrived in July of 1749 that sort of illustrates his skill at dealing with native diplomacy. There was a Seneca man named Daniel-Hyacinthe-Marie, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Daniel-Hyacinthe-Marie stole some trade goods and canoes from French traders. Beaujeu had him arrested and locked in irons in the prison here at Fort Niagara. And it wasn't long before native people from Petit Rapide, which is where Buffalo is today, and another village called Grand Village, they arrived here to protest Beaujeu's incarceration of this young man. Well, Beaujeu talked to them and then he sent them away. He said, "I'm going to have the fort gates closed now. Please come back in the morning and we'll discuss this." So there's a cooling off period here involved. Well, the delegates came back the next morning, and this is the speech that he gave them according to the letter that he wrote to the governor. And listen carefully to the language. And you can see a a master diplomat at work here. He said, "Your visit yesterday evening, my children, to beseech me to release your brother, believing his punishment too severe, and to tell me that you feared that the young people may cause trouble. I repeat once again, I do not fear your young people, and I am not speaking about war. If there was a question about war, it would soon be finished." Well, that would probably be true, but maybe not the way he wanted it. "This is a house of peace. It has been such during the war and must always be so. This is why I punish a scatterbrain who might make bigger mistakes and contribute by this to disrupt the course of this peace that you have so many reasons to maintain. You are coming, no doubt, now for the same reason, since you must know that he escaped this night from the prison and that he went over the stockade after having broken his irons, about which I am not at all angry, for I expect that you are so distressed at his offense and that he himself regrets it enough to consent to your entreaty to restore that which he stole from the French. If he does not try as soon as possible to come back into favor with me, the village of Petit Rapide should not expect any kindness on my part, and the only way to retain my friendship is to pay." So both the carrot and the stick here are at work. Ultimately, the situation is resolved. The villagers produce a horse to pay off Teonaene's debt, and then Beaujeu distributes bread and brandy to calm their spirits. So this situation is amicably resolved. Everyone saves face, everyone goes away mollified, at least, if not happy. So this is an example of his ability to conduct diplomacy. And he did this here at Fort Niagara. He also had a couple of other challenges. He had to explain to the Haudenosaunee people about Abbé Piquet's new mission at La Présentation. And he also worked hard to maintain peace among nations that were fighting each other around the Great Lakes. His other problem was Oswego. This is a British post that was 150 miles east of Fort Niagara. And the French always had very great frustration in watching Native people take their furs down to Oswego, passing right by Niagara on their way. And of course, trade also equals political and military alliances. So this was a very, very sore point with the French here at Niagara, all this business going down to Oswego. Beaujeu said of it, "If one does not raise Schweigen, we must of necessity distribute brandy and cloth at the same price as the English." So he has a proposal. He proposes that a small fort be built above Niagara Falls. He also begins to improve the Portage Road. This road project will not be finished until Claude-Pierre Piccoli de Contrecoeur is commandant a couple of years later, but at least it gets started. The fort above the falls, though, was designed, it was called Fort du Portage at the time, sometimes called Little Niagara. But the idea was that native traders could forego the difficult Niagara portage and trade with the French above the falls, and brandy would be available there as well. So that was the idea. And here's where family connections come back again. Beaujeu suggested this idea to his brother-in-law, Varin, and Varin pushed it through. And in 1751, this outpost was built above Niagara Falls. And it later on becomes an important jumping off place when the French begin to occupy the Ohio Valley. Well, the next mention we have of Beaujeu here at Fort Niagara is when Peter Kalm visits the fort in 1750. And here is Kalm's account of his visit here. He says, after a fatiguing travel, first on horseback through the country of the 6 Indian nations to Oswego, and from thence in a canoe upon Lake Ontario, I came on the 12th of August in the evening to Niagara Fort. The French there seemed much perplexed at my first coming, imagining I was an English officer who, under the pretext of seeing Niagara Falls, came with some other view. But as soon as I showed them my passports, they changed their behavior and received me with the greatest civility. As it was late when I arrived at the fort, I could not the same day go to the fall, but I prepared myself to do it the next morning. The commandant of the fort, Monsieur Beaujeu, actually this is spelled Bonjour, Monsieur Beaujeu invited all the officers and gentlemen to supper with him. And I suspect that that supper was had in the officers' dining room that adjoined the commandant's quarters. If you visited Fort Niagara, you know the room that I'm talking about. The famous Pater Kalm had dinner right there. Now, Kalm's story is interesting because he leaves Niagara and he heads back east through the Mohawk Valley. And I'll leave it to your discretion whether you think this is espionage or not. But a little later on, William Johnson writes to the governor of New York. And he says, I think it my duty to acquaint your excellency that Mr. Kalm, a Swedish gentleman who was lately at my house on his return from Niagara, said he assured me he read a letter from the Lord Intendant of Quebec to the commanding officer at Niagara, which was Beaujeu, wherein he desires him to supply all Indians who pass on their way to Oswego with goods at such a price as may induce them to trade there. He will not regard the loss of 20 or 30,000 livres a year to the crown. He also allows said officer to supply said Indians with what quantity of brandy or rum they may want. And I just, is this a letter that Beaujeu would have shared around? I really don't think so. So I don't know the circumstance here, but suffice to say that Kalm did carry intelligence to William Johnson. Well, the next step is his appointment. He serves at Fort Niagara till 1751. In 1751, there is a new commandant, a Monsieur de Bécancourt. So the next we hear of him is in 1755, when he is appointed to command Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio. Now, he's appointed by the Governor General Duquesne to do this. And so he sets off in April, and here's his progress. He departs Montreal on April 23rd. May 18th, he arrives at Fort Niagara. June 1st, he departs Fort du Portage above the falls. So between May 18th and June 1st, he is carrying all of his munitions and his provisions and his supplies and his men and his boats. He's carrying them around Niagara Falls. And this is taking a long time. This is a very difficult portage when you're trying to move an army over it. He arrives at Presqu'île on June the 8th, moves down French Creek to Venango by the 11th or 12th of June. At Venango, he advises there, he wants a more substantial fort built there. Later that becomes known as Fort de Machaut, but it's not there in 1755. And then on the 27th of June, he arrives at Fort Duquesne. And the tension and the pressure is building at this point because the French know that Braddock's army is on its way. They have scouts out. They know that Braddock's approaching. They think he has as many as 3,000 men coming after Fort Duquesne. So, you know, they're saying to Beaujeu, hurry, 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 we need reinforcements. Braddock is closing in. When Beaujeu arrives at Fort Duquesne, Braddock is at Gis Plantation, which is about here. It's a place called Mount Braddock in Pennsylvania. He's not too far from Fort Duquesne. He's probably about 50 miles away. So if you do the math, if you make 4 miles a day in the 12 days between Beaujeu's arrival and the Battle of the Monongahela, if you only make 4 miles a day, you're going to close this distance. So there's quite a bit of worry and tension on the French side of this as Braddock moves inexorably forward. The French officers at Fort Duquesne, the commandant of the fort, Claude-Pierre Picoty de Contrecoeur, he's having some health problems. He has some sort of an injury, and he also suffers a fairly serious skin condition. So he has asked to be relieved, and that's why Bonjour is out here to take his place. So the officers consult, and they know very, very well that Fort Duquesne is in no condition to withstand artillery. So what are we going to do? Well, Beaujeu speaks with his native allies on the evening of June the 8th, and things are somewhat undecided. The next morning, Beaujeu goes, according to accounts, he goes to the chapel, he has confession and takes communion, and then he goes out and speaks again with the native allies. And one anonymous account from the French side says, the next morning, Monsieur de Beaujeu left this fort with the few troops he had and asked the Indians for the result of their deliberations. They answered that they could not march. Monsieur de Beaujeu, who was kind, affable, and sensible, said to them, I am determined to confront the enemy. What? Would you let your father go alone? I am certain to defeat them. With this, they decided to follow him. So just never mind the wrong date on this map, but most conventional accounts of the Battle of the Monongahela, they record that Beaujeu had hoped to dispute Braddock's crossing of the Monongahela River. Let me find my cursor here. Yeah. But they got a late start on the morning of July the 9th, and they were unable to do that. And so most of the older accounts state that as they hurried toward this ford of the Monongahela, the French ran straight into the advance guard of the British, and that it was a meeting engagement. More recent scholarship, David L. Preston, I highly recommend his book, has found some new sources that revise our understanding of this engagement. It appears that Beaujeu had a plan. Beaujeu had scouts out. He knew that Braddock had crossed the river, and he had a plan for dealing with Braddock's column. This plan involved developing both sides of this long drawn out column with native warriors, each with a French officer as liaison, that the Compagnie Franche de Marine troops and the milice would block the road while the natives fanned out along both flanks of Braddock's army. So these new accounts indicate that Beaujeu had a plan going into this thing. So what happens is everyone is pretty familiar with what happened on this day. In the opening volleys of the battle, in fact, most accounts say the third volley, Beaujeu is hit with musket fire and immediately dies. His second in command, Dumas, rallies the troops, and they press down onto the British flanks. For the British, of course, this is a disaster, and I'm not going to talk about the Battle of the Monongahela in detail, but suffice to say, the French and native forces, about a little less than 900 on the field. Braddock has between 12 and 1,300 men. and it is a shooting gallery. The British try to hold the field for several hours. Braddock is mortally wounded. The British sustain about 500 killed and 450 wounded, and they leave the field to the French. Jean-Daniel Dumas, who is with Beaujeu's death, is now in command of the French. According to his account, he discovered Beaujeu's body in one of the ravines. He said, it meant a great deal to me to find the body of Monsieur de Beaujeu. I found it hidden in a gully near the road. The body is taken back to Fort Duquesne, and it was buried on July the 12th. The chaplain at Fort Duquesne, Father Baron, states that in the year 1755, on the 9th of July, was killed in the battle fought with the English. The same day, Monsieur Lienard Daniel, Esquire, Sieur de Beaujeu, captain of infantry, commander of Fort Duquesne and of the army, who was aged about 45 years, having been at confession and performed his devotions the same day. His remains were interred on the 12th of the same month in the cemetery of Fort Duquesne under the title of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin at the Beautiful River, and that with the customary ceremonies by us, Recollet priest, the undersigned chaplain of the king at the above mentioned fort, and testimony whereof, etc., etc. So where is Beaujeu buried? Well, somewhere under the city of Pittsburgh. No one knows exactly where his grave may be. There is an interesting plaque on the rear wall of the Presbyterian Church in Pittsburgh, of all places, on Oliver Avenue, designating that avenue as the Alley of the Virgin. Under the golden lilies of France, this street was dedicated to the last mortal journeys of those who perished in the defense of Fort Duquesne, and was reverently named Allée de la Vierge. So there are some that speculate that the cemetery might have been a little further from Fort Duquesne. It's probably about a 15-minute walk between those two places, but we don't know. No one really knows. The one thing is that this would be higher ground and would not have been in as much danger of being washed out. But suffice to say that somewhere under the city of Pittsburgh, in an unmarked grave, lie the remains of Daniel-Hyacinthe-Marie Lienard de Beaujeu. Now, after the battle, of course, this was a great victory for the French and their native allies. And of course, when there is a great victory, everyone wants to take credit for it. The great Roman strategist Tacitus said, "This is an unfair thing about war. Victory is claimed by all, failure to one alone." Well, I think Braddock gets his share of blame in popular literature on the British side, but on the French side, there were various accounts that talked about whose plan it was. Some accounts credit the plan to Contrecoeur. Some accounts credit the victory to Dumas. Recent scholarship, I think, has returned more of the credit to Beaujeu for coming up with the plan in advance that eventually defeated Braddock's forces. I think the best epitaph for Beaujeu was coined by David L. Preston in his book, Braddock's Defeat. Preston wrote, "He was uncommonly effective, fearless in combat, and adept in the art of persuasion in councils with natives." I think this about sums it up. In closing tonight, I would recommend to you two books. Preston's book on Braddock's Defeat, if you haven't already read this. It's a great book. You'll enjoy it. If you'd like to learn more about the Nova Scotia campaign during King George's War, I also recommend James Pritchard's Anatomy of a Naval Disaster. And with that, we're going to close out the slides. and I would be glad to try to answer any questions anyone might have. Thank you for your interest. Okay.
Yeah, question time now?
Yes.
Yeah, if
Okay,
you have a
you-
question, go ahead and just go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay, great. Yeah. Yeah, my question is, I don't know if I recall correctly or not, but you mentioned Beaujeu's journal. Is that translated into English? And what is the title of that I could maybe find on the computer or Amazon or something?
The only source I'm aware of is in French.
Oh, okay.
They have been translated, but I'm not aware of it. It was published actually, and I'm trying to look here for the citation. But the journal was published, and actually, if I don't know that I can find it in a timely manner here, but if you would care to email me, remerson@oldfortniagara.org, I can give you that that citation. I just I don't have it right here in front of me at the moment.
Okay, yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
It was a 28,000 word journal. So, and we found that here at Fort Niagara too. He wrote a lot of letters while he was here that are quite descriptive of what was going on.
Bob,
Go ahead, George.
well, under his name, are you going to post this on your website, this program, or will it be available to others who haven't been able to see it like George?
It's being recorded. So we'll probably
It'll be a
Probably
YouTube channel with
put it up on YouTube.
yeah, with a Facebook link so people can see it. So if you're following us on Facebook, you'll be able to get it.
Okay,
If you're not, we'll see if we can put it up on the website too with a link.
okay, well, I'll let him know. And if I may, a little bit more about Beaujeu's resting place. What I understand or have read is that, yes, he was after, they used to bury at the fort, but the floods, of course, would bring all the bodies up. So there was an Indian burial ground up Virgin Alley on 6th Avenue. There's 2 churches there. And at one time, they say that there was over 4,000 bodies in that cemetery at that time, the area that they were using. When urban renewal came in and they started digging, and you couldn't put the shovel in the ground without digging up bones, supposedly they found an officer's grave, which they believed was Beaujeu. And that's when they took all those bones that they were finding out to Lawrenceville to the cemetery out there, and they created a section where they just buried all these bones. They don't know, didn't have names, didn't know who was who, but they just created that section. So supposedly he was reinterred in some manner back out there in Lawrenceville. There's a few bones under the crypt of one of the churches, but again, there's no names. They don't know who's really there, who isn't. So, but supposedly they moved everybody out there, but they did find an officer's uniform or trappings in the grave.
Thank you, Bob.
You're welcome.
I remember that plaque. I was married in that Presbyterian church in 1983. And as we went out the back door to go toward the William Penn Hotel where our reception was going to be, my wife pointed that plaque out to me. So I do remember it.
I'm going to say I have seen it. Probably didn't pay as much attention as I should. Got interested in the cemetery for other reasons. And, that's when I found out about the size of it and, things that occurred.
Any other questions?
Yes. What was the most surprising thing that you learned about Beaujeu during your research?
I think probably the most shocking thing was the rape charge against his father. That kind of floored me. And it was, a fairly detailed and graphic account as well. So yeah, and in the course of my research, I think that was what shocked me the most.
Hey, Bob.
Hello.
Hi, it's Carl Skopinski. First of all, excellent presentation as always. I have a question. You talked about 1751, the building of Fort du Portage. That was the one that was closer to Gill Creek. Well, what is now known as Gill Creek. Was there any reference? I'm run across on a couple of occasions a stone blockhouse that was at the Old French Landing. Was there any writings or any type of documentation regarding the existence of that house or that blockhouse?
At that time, not that I have seen. Most of the descriptions of Fort du Portage sort of painted as a pretty ramshackle place.
Yeah, I've run into a couple of occasions where I've seen it mentioned that there was a stone blockhouse at the Old French Landing, which would have been closer to Daly Boulevard and Buffalo Avenue, 10th Street. And I was just kind of wondering, because there's really no mention of it in any historical record after that point. I mean, there's no traveler mention of it. No. And I've never run across any reference to it. So,
no, I didn't see anything about it in connection with Beaujeu. He's going to have Beaujeu is going to have two experiences with the Niagara Portage. One, of course, when he was Commandant here, and he had to hustle Celeron across the portage, and then he comes back here in 1755. And I think it's interesting, and it's sort of a measure of his character, I think, that while he is muscling his detachment, his army across that portage, he's making recommendations for how the portage could be improved. Yeah, this is just the kind of guy he was. I think he was sort of a hell-bent for leather individual. It was said of him that he always ran toward the musket fire. And I think that's a fairly apt description. I know most of us, if we were engaged in some huge logistical undertaking, we would just be thinking about getting the job done. But he was thinking about the longer term and how things could be improved.
Looks like Don Hamilton has his hand up.
I had a comment, but I'm not sure this computer mine is picking it up. Is it?
Yeah, we can hear you.
You hear you?
Okay. I can't say enough good things about Preston's book. It's absolutely outstanding, and I've tried to read all the various books on Braddock's massacre, as I called it, but I was intrigued by Preston, and it has been a few years that I read it, but I've attended his talks, and I think he said the Indian forces actually split up from the French and crossed the river on their own, which was very, very risky, but it all turned out fine for them. Does that ring a bell with you?
Yes, it does. One of the accounts states that one of the native detachments crossed the river and then recrossed it again,
Yeah.
which would have been very risky. It's not mentioned in all of the accounts, but it is mentioned in at least one of them. So
Yeah, Preston's the first one I heard that from, but that has been a few years back. I've been to his talks, and if there's any way you can go do it, and I'll put a little plug in for the Braddock's Road Association. They have had him talk to them, and they meet the first week of November each year. And of course, it's a very active group, and they lead bus trips to the Braddock Road, and it's absolutely worth the effort. I've been about 4 times, and I enjoyed and learned from each one. That's all I comment on.
I don't know where they would have crossed the river, closer to its mouth, closer to its juncture with the Allegheny. I don't really understand where they would have crossed. I do know they wouldn't have taken the Liberty Bridge.
Yeah.
We have a question from Anthony Hammond.
Yeah, hi Rob. Again, wonderful presentation, was very informative. So thank you so much for taking the time. I was curious to know, do we know anything of any surviving family? Because I know you said they had about a kid a year, and there maybe only were 2 that survived. Do we know anything about that family legacy in any way?
I have not really pursued that. I do know that one of their daughters lived to be 80 years old. She did not pass until the 1820s. So it's possible that, there were descendants. I just don't know. I didn't look any further than the immediate children. But it is possible. I think there are descendants. There was a hagiography written by someone named whose nom de plume was Monongahela de Beaujeu.
Interesting.
And it was early 20th century. I'm looking for it here. And it almost seems like it's written by a descendant. It's somebody who really admired Beaujeu and was a little bit, I think, creative with some of the story. Here it is. It's called The Hero of Monongahela, Historical Sketch by Monongahela de Beaujeu, Life Member of the Numismatic and Antiquarian Society of Montreal. Translated from the French by Reverend G.E. Hawes, published for the dedication of the monument erected to the memory of Major General Edward Braddock. So this is ironic. 15th of October, 1913. It says edited by Monsieur de Beaujeu and Company, New York, and printed by a printer in New York. And then on the title, on the next page, it says dedicated to my charming life companion, Madame Monongahela de Beaujeu, née, N-E-E, Adelaide Magdalene Vogt. So, yeah, I haven't really pursued that.
Sure, yeah, thank you for that answer.
And Andre has a comment there that leads us to the Acadia journal that was asked about earlier.
There's another question. What happened to Fort Portage?
Oh, well, Fort du Portage, it was placed under the control of Daniel de Chabert. And in 1759, when Fort Niagara lay under siege, Captain Pouchot had sent orders to Chabert that if the English appeared before his fort, he was to destroy it and abandon it, cross the river, come down the Canadian, what's now the Canadian side, and cross over into Fort Niagara. And that's exactly what happened. So, so Chabert burned his own fort. It was destroyed in July of 1759. It was a wooden fort, so it caught fire pretty quickly. In 2009, we erected a facsimile thereof out of half-split logs, and we reenacted the burning, much to the delight of the Niagara Falls Fire Department.
Do you know if any of Beaujeu's writings elaborate on his impressions of various native peoples or his comfort among them?
Most of what he is writing is describing to the governor his actions that he took in interacting with native people. But he's not like Pierre Pouchot, who writes in quite some detail about native customs and clothing. I have not come across anything, like that. He's more or less giving an account of what the writings I've seen, especially here, is giving an accounting of what he has done and how he has dealt with native diplomacy here at the fort.
I think that's all the questions we have.
Oh, I have one last one, if that's okay.
John Ridge, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to ask, like, in your recent studies and research, have you discovered any other like French officers in North America that were able to like effectively cooperate with and coordinate attacks and operations with Native American allies, or was Beaujeu the only one that we've been able to find so far?
No, there were quite a few that were good at it. I could start a list, but we would be here a while if we did that. But there were a lot of French officers that were quite adept. There were some bad ones too. Not every French officer was good at native relations. An officer who preceded Captain Pouchot here at Fort Niagara was very unpopular with native people. So it just depended on the individual, but there are quite a few that were quite effective at managing and working with native allies.
I think that's it.
Well, I'd like to thank everybody for attending tonight. Our next program for Women's History Month is on March 31st, and there we will put out ways to register soon. That's Hannah Weber. She's going to be talking about Isabella Graham. Isabella was a surgeon's wife who lived here at Fort Niagara in the early 1770s. And she's one of the best documented women here at the post. So please join us for that. And then in April, we're going to be looking at Jeremy Lister, who was a young British officer here again in the early 1770s. We're going to be looking at his trip from West Yorkshire, where he was commissioned, to his experiences here on the Niagara, and then his ending up in the Battle of Lexington and Concord. So that's our series for the spring, and we thank you for your interest, and we thank you for attending.